Welcome to another Dr. Sadler Chalk and Talk, this lecture series in which I address questions, problems, issues, concerns that get either sent to me by readers, viewers, emailed to me by people, or which come up in classes and conversations that I think would be kind of useful for people to think about, to reflect upon. This is something that I've been thinking about for a very long time, in part because every time that I teach Plato's Republic Book 4 or shoot a video about it, there's always somebody who says, aha, that looks exactly, that tripartite division, that looks exactly like what's going on in Freud. Can I map the two of them onto each other? And the simple answer is no, not really. But I want to talk about why that's the case. Is there really a connection between Plato's tripartite version of the human soul and Freud's tripartite model of the human psyche? In order to figure that out, we have to actually lay them out first. So let's look at what we actually have. Plato says that we have the human being, and at least with the soul part, there's also the body, but the body is closely connected with the appetites. We have three parts, and he has this modeled after an ideal city, and I'm not going to go into that because there's plenty of videos out there about that. He says we have a rational part of our soul, the part of our soul with which we learn, with which we reason, with which we think. And this part of our soul is very important. When it's functioning well, it can direct us towards our goods, what it is that human beings need, desire, will be made happy by. We also have an appetitive part of the soul. We have desires that draw us after different things. Food, drink, sex, laying around and sleeping all day. You know, we have the bodily appetites, usually tied to things that have to do with the body. Then we have this third part of our soul, which is concerned with, on the one hand, matters of honor and dishonor. So it's looking at how other people see us and how we thereby see ourselves, whether we have value or don't, whether we're being treated lower than we deserve or being treated higher than we deserve. It's a part with which we also feel shame, Plato thinks. But it's also the part with which we get angry. It's the part of us that has dynamism to it. The appetites, pull us in different directions, but they're fairly simplistic. This part of our soul is like, think about it, constantly churning. And he calls this thumos, which is, in some Greek authors, the very word for anger. And this is logos, and this is epithumia, desire. So we have these three parts, and in order for a human being to be doing well, they all have to be functioning the way that they're supposed to. So that's Plato's view. We'll come back to it in a moment. Let's look at Freud's now. Freud, let's start from the bottom. That makes most sense. For Freud, we have something that's like the appetitive part called the id. It's this repository of desires that are not, well thought out, that are for the most part unconscious or subconscious. We find ourselves driven by them. This is the part of us that wants to sleep, eat, have sex, enjoy ourselves all the time. That demands those sorts of things. So that is kind of similar to Plato's thing. And then we have the superego. Now I'm jumping to the top. And the superego is the part of the soul in which morality, in a kind of stilted, formulaic, pushing down on you, giving you rules kind of sense of duty, all that sort of stuff, that's where that resides. And what Freud thinks that actually is just the internalized voices, commandments, ideas of other people who you've been involved with. You've made them part of your own psyche, so you've got this kind of babble, or perhaps fairly unified chorus of voices saying, thou shalt not, inside of your head. And the poor ego, that's where you are, for the most part. That's the conscious part of yourself with which you actually make decisions, think about who you are, and the ego is torn in part between the demands of the superego to do the right thing, which, the superego actually gets to define the right thing, and the id, for whom the right thing is always whatever's going to give me the most enjoyment right now. So the ego is the part that mediates between the two of them, and it's really where the human being most is. For Plato, the human being really is most here in these parts. So let's talk about the functions now of these parts. What are they supposed to do? So in Plato's model and in Freud's model, the id and the appetitive part really look pretty similar. They're doing more or less the same kind of stuff. They're telling us, hey, you see that attractive person over there? Go try to have sex with them. And if you can't have sex with them, at least, like look at them and talk with them. Hey, that beer over there, drink it up. Hey, what's that going on over there? Let's go take a look. That's what the id and the appetitive part are doing. For Plato, the appetitive part is also particularly interested in making money, too. And greed would be an issue, a failure of the appetitive part. I don't think, well, you could say that fits in with Freud. Once money becomes a symbol for the things that the id truly desires. So there it works. Now, what about the rational part? Rational part, it's supposed to be thinking out what is actually good for the person. It's supposed to be giving orders that the spirited part then helps to impose on the appetitive part. It also does give orders to the spirited part, and it's able, Plato doesn't spell this out that much, but it's able to give orders to itself, If it realizes that its thinking is out of whack, it can say, I got to fix this, let me figure out how I can think better. Maybe I take a critical thinking class, Or, hey, spirited part, you need to be in anger management. Appetitive part, no, you can't eat thirds with every single meal and wash it down with a six-pack each time. So the rational part gives rules. It does this, hopefully, in light of genuine knowledge about what is good or bad for human beings and what is good or bad for me as a human being. The spirited part, it has a function as well. Actually, several functions. One is it's supposed to protect us. We do need to get angry about some things. We also do need to be concerned about how other people view us so that we can, when they're trying to push us down, we can push back. We can rightly evaluate those sorts of things. We do need to have, a desire for that is not simply a matter of bodily appetitive desire, something that's a little bit more transcendent to them. The spirited part doesn't do a lot of, going around and learning things for its own sake. It's primarily oriented towards what is making us angry or calm, or what has to do with honor, our viewpoints on ourselves, those sorts of things. But the spirited part is supposed to be an ally to the rational part in imposing its rule upon the appetitive part. So that's Plato. What about Freud? Well, the id, we've already talked about that. What does the superego do? That's a good question. The superego does give commands that sort of push down, so it's kind of like the rational part. And if the superego is working particularly well, I suppose it will get the ego to sort of go along with its demands and push down on the id, or at least repress its impulses, which is going to make the ego actually quite unhappy. There's a big difference. Whereas the spirited part, when it's really functioning the way it's supposed to for Plato, and when the rational part is giving proper directions to the spirited part is doing exactly what it was made for. It feels great. Whereas the ego, when it's dealing with the commands of the superego being imposed on the id, it's really torn. It's really not in a happy condition. That's why ego psychology was in part to set up the ego as opposed to the superego and the id. Later development of Freudian psychology that Adler and people like that did. What else does the superego do? Is it really rational? That's a good question. Does the superego really know what is good, or even inquire into what is the good for human beings? No, the superego is in a certain respect more imitative. It reflects and mimics what it is that has been internalized. So if you had a lot of people who thought that, for example, you should never back down from a fight. Don't you ever do that. Don't be like those putzes over there and those cowards over there. Be like, all the rest of us tough guys. That could be your superego, and then that's pushing down on your ego. That may not be the best thing for you. Or, we must never, ever discuss sex at the dinner table, because that's not what nice people do. A lot of people have that in their superego as well, right? There's nothing that guarantees that what's going on in the superego is going to be rational. And the superego is not capable of reflecting upon itself to determine whether it is really in line with rationality. There, it's very different than Plato's rational part, isn't it? The ego doesn't necessarily have to be the actual, tough guy corresponding to the military, the police, what the spirited part in Plato's vision does correspond to. Now, of course, you could have a slack, spirited part that's unable to, impose itself, but this is the part of the human being that's actually able to get angry at yourself and say, get the appetites in check, Can the ego do that? It's debatable. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is, so if the superego is not really rational, where does rationality come in here in the Freudian model? Comes in the ego, doesn't it? If at all. That's the place where reflection is able to occur, at least with traditional Freudian theory. It gets complicated when we look at other sort of variants of it. But that's the part that's able to sort of make decisions. So in a way, the ego is a little bit like the spirited part, the superego is a little bit like the rational part, but they're actually quite different from each other in many respects, based on their functions. You could also think about this in terms of the relations between the parts. Do the relations actually pan out the same? And I think the answer is largely no, except in that this bottom part remains more or less similar. And you simply cannot allow the appetitive part of the id to run wild, because if unchecked, they will run wild. What constitutes a disorder for a person? What's a disordered soul? Plato says that when a person commits injustice, it's because it comes out of the injustice within their soul, the disharmony between these three parts. There's something wrong either with the individual parts or the way in which they function in relation to each other. So think about a person, for example, who is dominated by the appetitive part, who is dominated by a need to make more and more money and evaluate everything in terms of money, for whom even their self-worth is tied up with money, and their rationality is exclusively put to the service of making lots and lots of money. They're unable, because of the deficiency in the rational part, to reflect on this and say, wow, I've really screwed things up, I've gone off the tracks. They're unable to put limits on their appetites, and actually the appetites are running the show at that point. They're on top. Plato also thinks that the spirited part could assert its dominance over the rational part, and it could be quite ascetic, keeping the appetites in check, but solely concerned with honor. Something that my students will often point out to me is there could be problems even with the rational part being sort of detached from these other things and not taking their proper needs, desires into account, and being far too intellectual and ascetic. And these could all be disorders from a Platonic point of view. What about Freud? Well, for Freud, one of the biggest problems, like I pointed out, is you have the id saying to the ego, hey, I want, so it's putting pressure on the ego that way. And the superego, likewise, putting pressure there. And the ego, poor ego, is trapped in between, is the locus of conflict. And within, sort of traditional Freudian theory, where you're using these three functions, these three parts of the soul, these three parts of the psyche, because Freud didn't always use this, he had other models as well. But if you're using this, the ego is the locus where the conflict is sort of spilling out, but the conflict is actually taking place behind the scenes in what's going on here, what's going on here. One may not even be very conscious of what is in one superego. Certainly the id is in large respect unconscious. And a lot of the disorders play out in the field of the ego, and the ego's like, God, I have no idea what's going on with me. Why do I, find myself just, buying jar and jar after of peanut butter and then just putting them on the shelf? I don't know, there's something wrong with me. Or, pick whatever sort of other weird example, that you've got. And there's lots of disorders that come out of this. And the disorders come about in large part not because, the three parts are in disharmony with each other, then there's some sort of proper harmony. The Freudian view is that there's always going to be some degree of disharmony, and probably what you have to do is either strengthen the ego, like ego psychologists did, or figure out what's wrong with the id or what's wrong with the superego. Maybe quit listening to the superego if you can. Maybe the superego is actually fundamentally irrational, or you can focus on the subject rather than the ego, the way somebody like Lacan did. I don't want to go too deep into that sort of stuff. What I want to close with is in thinking about what the purposes of having these models are. Psychotherapy is therapeutic. Platonic philosophy is not meant to be merely descriptive, nor merely prescriptive in the sense of like telling you, here's exactly what you need to do, here's the kind of person you need to be. It's also meant to be therapeutic as well. Socrates saw himself as trying to help people, and then so did Plato. So there's goals here of trying to live a more human, more integrated, more happy life. They have different views of what that would constitute. One of the things that Freud said that was particularly striking, and a lot of analysts and commentators have brought this up, is this German phrase, Wo es war, soll ich werden. Now, S is the id. Id is just Latin for S. S is the German for that, and it just means that, right? The neuter. Ich is ego. Ego is the Latin for I. Ich is the German for I. So where this unconscious, seething, driving us, getting us into all sorts of trouble, going off into weird corridors of action, habit, thought, desire. Where that was, we want this to be. We want to become conscious of what in the hell is going on with me and with other people. Now notice, that doesn't say anything about the superego, does it? Whereas now Plato's view would be something more like, like he said, the rational part should be running the show, telling the spirited part, get those appetites to do what I'm telling them to do, and then telling the appetites, hey you can't eat as much as you want, here's the right amount for you to eat. Let's just stay within these bounds and we're going to be A-okay. So these are very different projects. I think they do both, if you use them right, they do both involve self-discovery and being able to make decisions about what kind of person one wants to be. They propose to us quite different models. The Freudian one, in some respects, is more open-ended. And it's also, in certain respects, more pessimistic about the capacities of reason to really do much with this sort of thing. Plato's view is actually quite a bit more optimistic. So, to go back to the original thing, are Plato and Freud's models of the soul identical? Definitely not. Are they similar? They're similar in that they have a tripartition. They're similar in that there's a goal in mind of living a better life. They're similar in that the bottom level looks very much the same. But they're not similar when it comes to the stuff that's actually more important. They're not similar when it comes to how, in fact, we ought to go about unscrewing up our lives, our existences, our mentalities, our attitudes, our patterns of behavior. So Plato and Freud are really not doing the same thing, even though they do have tripartite views of the soul that actually, have these things in conflict with each other to some extent. Hopefully, this addresses the issue in a way. It's it's a sort of nuanced view. Yes, partly you can connect them, but partly it's not that good of a fit.